So here are the answers to the questions from the previous chapter. So why don't you pause the video, tick your answers off, and then go on to the next chapter, which is speciation. Fossils. Now, fossils provide evidence for early forms of life. They can be the preserved remains of organisms, parts of the body that is, or they can be preserved traces. For example, the footprints or the droppings or the burrows. Now, fossils can be formed from the hard parts of organisms that don't decay very easily, for example the shells or the bones or the teeth. They can also be formed from the parts that didn't decay because the conditions were unsuitable for decay. So if you can think back to Unit 1, what were the conditions that suited decay? It was warm, moist and oxygenated. So if an organism died and it was immediately buried in a mudslide, for example, so that no oxygen could reach the microbes, then that organism is not going to decay. They could also be formed from the parts of the organism which are replaced by other materials. For example, parts that are mineralised. Now, fossils can tell us how much or how little organisms have changed over geological time. They show the changes over time, and they also show that there are similarities with modern species. So, did fossils provide valid, reliable evidence about early forms of life? Well, scientists are still uncertain because we just don't have enough valid, reliable evidence. Because many early life forms were soft-bodied, and these don't make great fossils. And many fossils have been destroyed by geological activity over time, for example by volcanoes, earthquakes, tectonic movements. So this leads to gaps in the fossil record. Extinction, now this is the loss of all individuals of a species. And this can be caused by a number of things. It can be caused by a single catastrophic event, for example by an asteroid strike or by a volcanic eruption. It could be caused by new predators, new diseases, new, more successful competitors. Do you notice I use the word new there? It's unlikely to be caused by old or pre-existing predators or diseases or competitors because the species in question would have evolved in parallel with them and would have mechanisms for dealing with predators, would have immunity to old diseases and ways of dealing with pre-existing competitors. So you have to get the word new in there. Also to wholesale changes to the environment over geological time, and also due to speciation. So speciation is the formation of a new species. Now it's important to understand the definition of the term species. A species is a group of similar organisms which can successfully interbreed. Notice it's an underlined term, successfully interbreed, and that means that they can produce offspring which are fertile. Now there are some species which can interbreed but produce sterile offspring. For example, horses and donkeys can interbreed, but their offspring, mules or hinnies, are sterile. So this is what makes them separate species. They can't successfully interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So how does speciation occur? Well, part of a population has to become isolated from the rest of the population or from the rest of the species. And this can be by geographical means, for example, a new body of water, some new physical barrier that means that part of that species can no longer interbreed with the rest of the species. They become isolated. And the two separated populations both have genetic variation. Now, if natural selection acts differently on the two populations, then different characteristics will be favoured in each population. Now, it's important in the exam to get this mark in here that natural selection has to act differently on the two populations. If natural selection acted the same on the two populations, then they would evolve the same, and you'd end up having no new species. So because of the different selection pressures, then different characteristics will be favoured in the two separated populations, which means that different alleles will be passed on in each population. And this will lead to genetic differences in the two populations, and over time the genetic differences will accumulate or build up to the point where the populations are now so genetically different that they can no longer interbreed successfully. So take note of those underlined terms there. Genetic differences accumulate is a really good phrase to use, and it's useful to remember that. So it'll occur until the two populations can no longer interbreed successfully. So here's a completely made up example of speciation in action. So you've got a bay with a load of jellyfish in it. They all look pretty similar, don't they? But what if there's a series of volcanic eruptions and you get a bunch of volcanic islands appearing, which will divide the sea into two, and the part of the sea on the left there becomes enclosed in a way that it wasn't before, and because it's a small body of water and there's a restriction in the currents, that sea warms up, it becomes warmer. Now, warmer conditions tend to favour smaller bodied organisms. So any jellyfish that were in that part of the sea that were smaller bodied will be favoured. So they will tend to be selected for, their characteristics are favoured. So the smaller jellyfish will breed more, so their allele for being small will be passed on more frequently. And so you'll end up with a population of jellyfish which are smaller than the parent population out in the open sea there. And the genetic differences will accumulate over time until the point where the two populations can no longer interbreed successfully, even if they could get to each other. So for the last time in Unit 2, you're nearly there now, test yourself on speciation. Answers coming up. Here's the answers to speciation. Good work, well done. Good luck in the exam.